Shalom everyone, and welcome back to the Pilgrim Youth channel. My name is Elizabeth Denicio, and today we will continue with part 2 of the study called A Renewed Pact to be Part of the Sanctuary Erected by Yeshúa, that was given last week by our sister Anna. Today we will be focusing on chapters 35 from verse 30th all the way to the end, and the entire chapter of 36. And we are going to see that, or we're going to be analyzing the celestial teachings that we in today's age can find in the commandments given by the Eternal to the people of Israel during the construction of the sanctuary, or as we have already learned in Hebrew, it is called a mishkan, a place of meeting, a tent of meeting, a place where it was a mobile place, and a place where Israel could meet with their Creator. If we remember that after Israel broke the covenant with the Eternal by rendering service and declaring that the golden calf was the reason why they were liberated from Egypt, and that this golden calf would guide them through the desert to the promised land, the Eternal's anger was set against them to extinguish them as a nation, and created a new, and that the Eternal would create a new one with Moshe. We saw in a couple of weeks that passed that Moshe intercedes for Israel and found favor and mercy in Elohim's eyes, and as a consequence, Israel was spared. It was not destroyed totally. Nevertheless, the Eternal had to clean Israel. Just because he had mercy and he showed his willingness to renew the pact didn't mean that he was going to let sin slide, or was not going to overlook the sin that Israel had committed with this idolatry, with this betrayal that they showed in their rebellion against the Eternal's commandments. So therefore, we saw that he cleansed Israel of the people who were rebellious, of those who willingly chose to go against the Eternal, and judgment was passed. The scriptures say that it was about 3,000 Israel men died at the hand of the Levites, who were the ones who declared themselves to being part or partaking in the side of the Eternal, and did not let their did not participate of that idolatrous practice, the ritual or festivity that they were doing to this pagan god. However, last week we began to analyze the Eternal's mercy and patience overall, and his willingness to renew the covenant with Israel. Like the first time, Elohim tells Moshe to cut 2 new tablets of stone, like the ones that he had broken, and Elohim wrote the commandments once again on them. Moshe ascended to Mount Sinai alone with the stone tablets, and scriptures say that his presence, or what we saw last week was that his presence, the presence of the Eternal, passed in front of Moshe. And while he passed before Moshe, he proclaimed himself, or the Eternal proclaimed himself, to be slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, but visiting the iniquity of parents up to the children. And we see that while this was happening, Moshe bows before the Almighty in worship and begs him for pardon, begs him to forgive these stiff-necked Israelites and accompany them to the promised land. Because remember, once they broke the pact, the Eternal said that he would not go down with Israel. He would not be by their side because of their betrayal. So here we see that the Eternal he has favor. Moshe found favor in the eyes of the Eternal, and therefore he pardoned Israel. And the Eternal then makes a covenant with the people, but he also commanded them to tear down the altars, the people around, or that the nations that they were going to conquer, because of the Eternal was going to give it to them, or he was going to give them the authority to overthrow the nations that the Eternal wanted to not expel, but wanted to get rid of, or wanted to clean the land to give it to Israel because of a purpose. So therefore, One of the commandments, if we remember last week, was that the people of Israel could not mix with the worship of the world, right? The worship, the pagan worship that that focused on rendering service or adoration, right, to another deity, or no, I'm sorry, not another deity, but another identity, another person, another thing that wasn't the Eternal. So the Eternal said that Israel had to, when they would overtake these places, that they had to, it was a commandment that they had to tear down all of their altars, all of their sacred places, in order for those practices not to contaminate Israel. And in addition to other commandments that were reiterated, right? Moshe was also fulfilling his role that we saw last week as intermediary, right, between the Eternal and the people of Israel. And we also read last week that the splendor and glory of the Almighty was radiating from Moshe's face when he descended from the mount and he came back to the people of Israel, because once again, he would go up to the Eternal, he would go up to the presence, the divine presence, he would get instruction and he would bring it back to Israel. And when he came down, the scriptures say that his radiance, the light that he portrayed or that he brought down of the Eternal, was too much for the Israelites to bear. So therefore he had to cover his face. And all of those, as we have already known, and the purpose of these studies of the Torah is that we look for the figures of Mashiach, right? That not only did these things happen in the context of Israel in the history, but we also find a lot of teaching and a lot of principles that we can take, and we can also find Mashiach in many of these, in many of the texts, even in the Old Testament, as people say it, or in the Torah. We see that these are shadows of and figures that point to the first century, when Mashiach would come and fulfill the covenant by giving his life in sacrifice. Now we know that when the Eternal was in this context of Israel right now, that they were kind of making amends for their wrong, and the Eternal was forgiving them in a sense, right? That he did not exterminate everyone. He loved the remnant, those who did not participate of these practices. So therefore, in the literal sense that he was renewing the pact, or this covenant that they had entered before, as we saw a couple of chapters ago, it wasn't like in a literal form in that moment. As we know that Yeshúa was the one who came and fulfilled this prophecy, right? Fulfilled this new covenant that was not only going to be open for Israel, but was going to be the redemption of the entire world. All of those who came out of the nations, and who also said, and who also with their life of testimony and their teshuvah, that they proclaimed in that manner, in their obedience and their submission to the Eternal and his will, that they too were part, or are part, or want to be part of the Eternal side, right? Of giving their life for the service of the Eternal, just like the Levites did. And lastly, we saw in chapter 35, verse 25, that the Eternal tells all Israel that anyone who's willing or moved or prompted to give a terumah, which we already know it was an offering, a special offering that came voluntarily from within, in gratitude, right, of materials to the building of the Mishkan, were going to be accepted. This is what we saw in those chapters. And this taught us that through Yeshua, our Mashiach, we are made into sanctuaries in him, right? And this is the same concept that we're going to be seeing in a couple of chapters, that we are now these sanctuaries, right? We don't have a temple to go to. We don't have, and we are not obligated, and we don't, actually, the scriptures doesn't sustain anywhere that we have to go congregate as a church, as a religious system. But now our bodies are considered these sanctuaries, right? Where we are the ones who are ministering it. We are the ones who have to be careful and make sure that our life is pure, or that our life, that we are not contaminating it with the practices that the Eternal already told us no, right? This is something very prominent in the last study, and in this study we will see it reiterated again. And we know, right, that we are sanctuaries, and we are to voluntarily, right, in the teachings of the Terumah, to give our life, our skills, and any ability that the Eternal has given us in the service of Him, right? And not only in the service, but in the purpose for which the Eternal has made us as a believer individually, and just the way that the Mishkan, an offering was given in order for the making of the holy place, right? Of not only in the literal form in the time of Israel, but also in the spiritual form, right? Where it had a holy purpose. Today, as I said, we will continue to analyze more figures and shadows within the commandments of the Mishkan that help us understand our function as sanctuaries that we become when we die to our flesh and are covered by the blood of the Lamb, which is Yeshúa. And not only that, but the responsibility that we have to our brothers and sisters that belong to the body of Mashiach, that are also in the walk of faith. In chapters 35 from verse 30 to 35, Moshe reiterates to the people of Israel that Bezalel, son of Ur, the son of Uri, and the son of Hur, that he came from the tribe of Judah, and as well as Holiab, son of Hisamach, of the tribe of Dan, were both filled of the spirit of Elohim that gave them certain characteristics, right? This is something that we did see a couple of, I believe it was chapter 31 from verse 2 to 11, that we saw the same concept. And some of the things, or let's say that when they received the spirit, these two men received the spirit of the Eternal, it was a spirit of wisdom, right? Of chogma, as we have already studied in that chapter. They also received understanding, which in Hebrew is tevunah, and they also received knowledge of science, or knowledge of how to do something. And this in Hebrew is called or known as da'at. And they also received, these men also, not only were they given these, but Moshe reiterated to all Israel that they were given these abilities in order for the Mishkan to be done or to be accomplished. So they were also given all kinds of skills in order to make artistic designs out of many kinds of materials. This place was going to be considered the most holy place, and it had its parts and it had its function. So therefore, everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be to what the model of the celestial one was like. So these men could accomplish every commandment. So not only were these men just given because they were favored and they wanted to maybe be proud in front of all Israel, like saying, oh, the Eternal has given me these powers or these or this position, and now I'm like the boss and I can do whatever I want. Well, we see here in the text that they were given these abilities for a purpose, right? And that purpose was that they can be able to complete or accomplish the commandments that the Eternal told Moshe that the Mishkan was supposed to have to the T, right? They were to accomplish it. And this is regarding, right? This is regarding the furniture and the design of the Mishkan, and how it was supposed to represent a celestial one that was found in heaven. Now, we remember that the Mishkan in the time of Israel was a shadow, or was a copy, right? As Hebrews 8 verse 5 says, it was a copy of the one that is in heaven. So that's why we see why the Eternal had to organize it this way, that not anybody can come, because we know that we're faulty people, right? And that in ourselves, we don't have the ability to give something good to the Eternal. And therefore, the Eternal, we have to ask the Eternal to help us give him a clean service, a service that he will consider perfect. So that's why these two men were able to receive these gifts, and they were able to now, because they were almost like under, right, they were given the ruach, or the spirit of the Eternal, in the sense of these aspects of understanding wisdom, so they can decide and know how to make these designs to perfection, because this place was going to represent perfection, purification, and a place where Israel would come and meet the Creator, which is not a whatever thing. Imagine having the presence of the Eternal, the Almighty, who made this entire world, this entire humanity was nothing just like, oh, well, we can just pitch a tent and that's it. It was something very special, and it was something very holy. Additionally, they were also given gifts with the ability to teach others. This is something that in the other chapter, it didn't mention. And that in this chapter as well, it tells us, or lets us know, that other people were also under the lead of Bezalel and Holiab, right? They were saying that these two men were given the understanding, but they were also given the ability to teach others. And these others were these men who came to the Mishkan who wanted to work. And they had to have the same level of skill and the same level of understanding for them to all kind of do, they can all work together in order to accomplish, to have this Mishkan in the perfection that the Eternal wanted it. And then one of the things that I didn't, or wasn't mentioned in that study in chapter 31, verse 2 to 11, was that the word in Hebrew or they were endowed, right, for a specific reason. And that was not only to be able to, in the literal form, they were given all of these attributes so they can create, right? That they can have something, a word called melacha in Hebrew, which has to do with occupation, work, business, service, and use. So just as Bezalel, and this teaches us, right, that just as they did, we, and they were equipped to present the Eternal with a perfect service, we too, or gives us the hope, right, or teaches us that we too are capacitated, we are abled, right, we are given certain abilities for us to render the Eternal a service that is clean, perfect, and acceptable to the Almighty. And it's interesting that the name of Bezalel means in the shadow of Elohim. So we see that in reality, it wasn't him in his own will, in his own efforts, that he was able to present the Eternal at the end of the Mishkan done, like saying, oh, well, this is what I did. This is what my intelligence made me think about these designs, right? But we see here that even his name reflected this aspect that the Mishkan and how beautiful it was and how intricate and how well structured wasn't because of a man's knowledge or a man's strength, but it was because those who live in the shadow, under the shadow of the Eternal, will always be able to present a perfect service to him. And this happens when we receive the Ruach HaKodesh, because we know in scriptures it tells us that it leads us to all the truth, and it guides us in our life and what decisions to make, whether we do it or we don't do it. And only through the Eternal's holy breath, with his spirit, both of these men were able to complete the Mishkan. They were able to give a work that was considered, in Hebrew, it's called tamim, which we will find this in the Strong's Concordance as H8549, which in Hebrew, it has to do with something complete, something sound, something intact, perfect, without blemish, without defect, whole, full, entire, and blameless. So these are the kind of attributes, this is the kind of work that we also need to present the Eternal, right? That whether we are wives, whether we are daughters, whether we are brothers and sisters in the faith, whether we are teachers, whether we are stay-at-home moms, or whether we're kids who are doing homeschooling, we have the responsibility to give the eternal work that is tamim, a life, right, and fruits that are intact, fruits that are without defect and that are full and whole and healthy. So this is something that we can learn from here, and we can also understand that this is a shadow of Yeshua, our Mashiach, that under the shadow of Adonai, because he also gave us an example of this, and he was also filled with the Ruach of the Father. Yeshua was able to manifest and give testimony to all humanity of Elohim's character, which is, we already know, it's justice, and not only did he reflect the character of the Father, but he also told humanity, or taught humanity, what is the commandments that the Eternal wants us to do. What are the requirements? What is the instruction of the Eternal in the correct interpretation? And that's why we see that in John 14, verse 6, we know that Yeshua is the way, he is the truth, and he is the life. No one can come to the Father except through him and through his sacrifice. So for us today, we are not required to give money or goods to a church or a temple, as many people think that that's the way that we serve the Eternal. But today we must be filled, and we must strive to be filled, and that our sanctuaries today, our bodies, our mind, this box that the Eternal has put our nefesh, our ruach, right, our soul in, has to be given as this sacrifice, right, as the service to the Eternal. And we have to minister it with the understanding, with the wisdom that the Eternal gives us through the Ruach HaKodesh. And we have to be guided and taught in truth. And not only that, but also look onto Yeshua's testimony as our example, because we need to be covered by his sacrifice, by his blood, to be able to give something tamim, something perfect to Adonai. And we know in scriptures, in Micah chapter 6, verse 8, it tells us, the Eternal has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Eternal require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your Elohim. So we see here, what is it actually that the Eternal wants us to do? It doesn't want us to go and serve in temples, or that we go in activism in the world and fight for all the rights for everyone, and that we risk our life, and that we risk our life to help animals. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying that those are not good things, but that's not what is primary. That's not what is important right now. It's not the first thing that should, when we wake up, we think about, right? When we wake up, we should think about, okay, the Eternal wants me to act justly. What does that mean in my life? How do I show this mercy? How do I show being just to our neighbors? And I'm not saying a neighbor literal from house to house, but I'm saying with our parents, right? Starting off with them first. They are our first neighbors, our sisters, our brothers, then the family in the faith. And how are we being testimonies to the people outside? So all of these things really show us many aspects of our pilgrimage in this world, and help us to remind us, right, that the things that we have, the skills that we think we own, are really not ours, and they have a purpose, and we should serve them, and we should use them for the service of the Eternal. In chapter 36, we're going to move on. We now begin to see that the work of the Mishkan is actually officiating. Now the commandments and the instructions have been given, what is supposed to be in the temple, in the Mishkan, like what colors were supposed to be used, what materials were supposed to be used, how the length, the width, the measurements, what measurements were supposed to be included in the Mishkan. And now, finally, it's time to start, right? Now, I'm going to read from verse 1 to 5, and it says, So Bezalel, Oholiab, and every skilled person to whom the Eternal The Eternal has given skill and ability to know how to carry out all the work of constructing the Mishkan, or the sanctuary, are to do the work just as the Eternal has commanded. Then Moshe summoned Bezalel and Holiab and every skilled person to whom the Eternal had given ability and who was willing to come and to do the work. Verse 3. They received from Moshe all the offerings the Israelites had brought to carry out the work of constructing the sanctuary. And the people continued to bring free will offerings morning after morning. Verse 4. So all the skilled workers who were doing all the work on the sanctuary left what they were doing and said to Moshe, the people are bringing more than enough for doing the work the Eternal commanded to be done. Then Moshe gave an order, and they sent his word throughout the camp. No man or woman is to make anything else as an offering for the sanctuary. And so the people were restrained from bringing more because what they already had was more than enough to do all the work. Wow, this portion really was very striking, right? Or it's very interesting, because here we see that Moshe summoned, right now, all of these men that were going to work in the Mishkan, and he gave them all of the materials that were given as voluntarily, right? That the people of Israel gave these goods as gold to build the Mishkan as an offering of terumah, as we learned last week, right? Some materials which also represent celestial aspects were given in abundance. So for example, we remember gold was given, and remember that gold represents Adonai's divinity, his presence. Silver also represents something. Silver is the word of the Eternal. Bronze was also given, and it represents either judgment or kingdom. Acacia wood represents humanity. So was being brought, right? Everything that was being brought to the Mishkan, the workers they were receiving in abundance. So every day they would come, and Moshe would receive, and he would just pass it along, to the point where the workers had to stop what they were doing because it was overflowing. I mean, I'm guessing and I'm thinking that if I was a worker in that time, I was thinking that maybe if I was working with gold, there was stacks of gold everywhere, and I didn't have space maybe to work, or I saw that it was just abundance and I did not need as much gold as what the people were bringing, right? So that's where they bring this, the workers bring this to the abundance was just too much, and it was brought to Moshe's attention. So we can ask ourselves, what did it take, right? What did it take to make the Israelites be so generous, right? Because it was so much, and not only to be generous, but why were they so willing to give these precious metals to the building of the Mishkan? Because if we see in our day and age now, people don't just give gold like that. You know, people are very stingy. People are very egoistic, very selfish, and in carnal nature, in our fleshliness, we can see how we act if we don't have, that's why I asked the question, right? What did it take for them to be able to be so generous? And what we see in scriptures is that they needed to recognize their error. Remember that this happened after they had broken the covenant, and how upset the Eternal was with Israel, and how the Eternal separated himself from the camp, his presence out of the camp, and that they were building the Mishkan out of the camp, because originally it was supposed to be within them. But then because of the idolatry of the calf, golden calf, they had to bring the service of the Eternal outside of the camp so it won't be contaminated. And this brought really a sadness, a disappointment within Israel. And now we see the effects, right? We see that they've had time to reflect. They've had time to think about and recognize their error, recognize their low state of sinfulness that they had fallen because of their rebellion, because of their idol worshiping. And we also saw on the other hand, that not only does reflection is needed, but also judgment was passed, right, through the camp, as we already said in the introduction, that 3,000 people died for their rebellion. So now they were more than eager, right, more than eager to serve the Father and amend their wrongs. They wanted to make it right. So here we see that the Eternal's mercy and favor towards the Israelites, and gave them another chance, gave them another opportunity to partake the event. And that's why we know him as the Elohim that's slow to anger, and that he loves us, but he will repay, he will punish the rebellion. He will, as a father, discipline those that he loves. And another aspect in these verses that that I reflected on was that it's interesting to see that many religious leaders, not only in the religion, in the whole entire world, but those of the people that say that they love the Eternal and they want to do the Eternal's will, which is mostly like the religious systems, they use these verses out of context, and they teach people that a true believer are those who give money in abundance to the churches, and that's their service, right? And thus the religion systems have twisted the Eternal's commandments and made it into a worldwide business. Within these systems, it is not seen that a leader comes in front of the congregation and says, stop bringing money because there's enough. On the contrary, we see that it's never enough, right? We see that there's always propaganda, there's always, and by experience, because I was part of a religious system, you would see that all the time they were asking for money. All the time, if you didn't give your tithings, right, your 10% of your money to the churches, then they would make faces at you, or they would not consider you. They were not so brotherly like. So we see that how different and how vastly there's a contrast, right, between what was going on in the Mishkan and what is going on in the religious systems today. That there's so much greed, there's so much corruption even within the religious systems, because we see it, right? We see that those who are on the higher ranks have a better way of living, have a lot of materialistic things that even Yeshúa spoke against. And even the Torah talks about it, right? It talks about having too much money, having too many things, because it feeds our fleshliness. And we see a whole contrast here. Here in these verses, we can notice the integrity, the honesty, and the earnestness of the men who were working to build the Mishkan. We see that Moshe, coming to the understanding that there was an abundance of gold. Can you imagine gold, silver, and other material resources that they probably could have used in the future? He did not want to keep anything that he did not need. So Moshe didn't want to keep all of those things for himself so he can put it and stash it in his tent. We see here that he was honest. When they came and told him, like, Moshe, there's so much gold here, there's so much silver, I have enough, I don't need any more. We see in verse 6 that Moshe restrained men and women from in Israel, in the camp, because it was announced of that it wasn't necessary anymore, that nobody should be giving more donations because there was more than enough. In the service of the Eternal will always provide where there is always more than enough. And we do not have the obligation to give money to systems and to think that that is the way that we gain pardon from the Eternal, or that we gain favor, or that we gain anything from the Almighty. And then from I'm going to keep going, from verse 8 to 38, it details how the curtains of the Mishkan were placed and held together by clasps. The men who were skilled made curtains that were finely twisted linen with blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, with cherubims woven into them by expert hands, it says. And we remember that even the colors had meaning, right? So for example, blue represented the sky or the celestial place where the eternal's place or habitation is. Purple represents royalty. Red represents sacrifice and blood, and the fine linen represents consecration and sanctification. So we see all of these mixtures, all of these combinations of colors that have meaning even within these curtains that were going to cover the most holy place and the holy place. And along with the colors, yarn, it says here that cherub figures were woven into the curtains. So the fact that these figures were on the actual fabric is not a commandment to idolize or worship the curtains. Many people who defend idol worshiping, or they say that, well, God doesn't care if we have statues and that we pray to it. Is that because he himself ordered that figures should be put on the curtains? But we don't see anywhere in scripture that says that the people of Israel are supposed to bow down to the cherubs. We see that that these figures were only there to represent things. So there is no justification for idol worshiping, and on the contrary, we see over and over that the Eternal tells Israel to make themselves apart from these pagan worshiping, because it is an abomination to the Eternal. In verse 9, it says that all the curtains were the same size. These are some measurements, so 28 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. So everything in the Mishkan was created with a purpose and to the exact measurement. And the following verses illustrates the details found on the curtain, and the loops were made in order for the clasps to unify every part altogether. In verse 13, it says, "Then they made 50 gold clasps or rings and used them to fasten the two sets of curtains together, so the tabernacle or the sanctuary was a unit." And this is something very interesting too, because we see this also proclaimed in bronze and many other things. But the Mishkan was done and completed as an echad, which is something very noticeable in these texts, which means one in Hebrew. The Mishkan was composed of many parts, as we have already detailed and we've already seen, but became one at the end by using these gold clasps, and the text says everything became a unit. So the gold clasps represent, as we have already mentioned, the divine presence of the Eternal. And in the spiritual aspect, Shaul explains that in Galatians chapter 3 from verse 27 to 28, that all of you who were baptized or who have been submerged in the water into Mashiach and have clothed yourselves with him, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor male or female, for you are all one in Yeshua HaMashiach. So we see here that even though we as a people of the body of Yeshua have our different skills, we live in different places, we have different abilities, we are all coming together, right? And all the believers that are covered by Yeshua's sacrifice and have done teshuvah and have not only done the baptism, as people call it, right, or the tevilah, or the submersion in water, but most importantly in the Ruach HaKodesh, and have done teshuvah, we too become part of Yeshua's body in his congregation and in his work. We are considered sanctuaries of which Elohim wants to abide in, a temple where our body is to be consecrated and sanctified for his holy service, just like the Mishkan has and had in his time a holy purpose. All believers are intertwined by these clasps or these like rings that represent the Eternal's divine presence, which is manifested through his Ruach HaKodesh in our life. Shaul also reiterates and stresses the importance of unity. of echad among the family of faith. In Ephesians 4, from verse 1 to 6, Shaul teaches us the following. As a prisoner for the eternal, then I urge you, he's talking to believers, and he might as well as talking to us too, to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. See, we do have a calling, and now he's explaining what are the attributes that we're supposed to be portraying, right? Humbleness, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another in love. Now, love is not a love like, okay, you can do whatever you want to me and that's it. The Eternal says that he disciplines those who he loves, and he teaches those who he loves. So that's the same thing that we do. We got to teach, and if somebody's doing something that's going against the word of the Eternal, it is our duty in a respectful way, in a biblical way, to tell that brother or sister for their own good. In verse 3, it continues to say, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. And the Spirit is the Ruach HaKodesh, is the Spirit of the Eternal. There is one body and one Spirit. So if we want to use our ability for something else, then we are not partaking of the body of the Eternal, of Yeshua. And there's only one Spirit. So we can all have, and we're all unified by this Ruach HaKodesh, by the Spirit of the Eternal. Just as it continues to say, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. Verse 5, one eternal, one faith, one baptism, one eternal Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. So this teaches us that the gifts and the talents that the Eternal has given each believer is to equip each and one of us, and we are to apply these skills, this ability in the service of the Eternal through Mashiach in order to truly build the celestial sanctuary. And as we're doing this, we're receiving the Ruach HaKodesh, and as we're growing in our faith, as we're continuing to pilgrimage in our life with other brothers and sisters, we come and we unify through the Ruach HaKodesh, because two people that have different mentalities cannot walk together. That's what scripture says. But if we do not have this Ruach HaKodesh that makes the congregation of Yeshua, like it starts to disintegrate, like it starts to separate, right? Or you separate yourself when we don't have the same Ruach that Yeshua had himself. And then we are not considered as partakers of Yeshua's work. And as a consequence, then we are seen as strangers and doing things that the Eternal has not asked us to do. And that's why in Matthew 7 from verse 21 to 23, at the end, we will see Yeshua says himself that many people will come to say, Lord, Lord, I did all of these in your name. Will I enter into the kingdom of heaven? But Yeshua says that he's going to tell them, he says, go away from me because I don't know you, right? It says, you evildoer. So we see here that Yeshua will only recognize those who truly are doing the will of the Father, because that's what it does, right? That all of those who want to enter the kingdom of heaven are the ones who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So that is a requirement. And at the end, only those who are paying attention, who are looking for the wisdom day and night, and does the will of the Eternal, can have access to the promise of eternity. That is through Yeshua. And then finally, from verse 14 to 38, specifically, we learn more about the materials used to make the curtains or the outside of the Mishkan. For example, some of it was a covering of ram skin dyed in red, and over that was another covering with a durable leather, which also has the representation, right? The leather and these skins represent the sacrifice, right? A sacrifice that Mashiach also did, and we are covered by it. Also, some other aspects of upright frames of acacia wood, silver braces, the frames for the corner of the tabernacle at the far end, and all the Mishkan, crossbars of acacia wood, and etc. We were all given right? Now we have seen that all of these elements kind of come together and are coming together, and as well as it kind of points to a time, an our time, right? That we should be unified. Maybe we're not all together in one place, right? But all of those who have the same ruach that Yeshua had, no matter where we live, we are all one. We are all one in Mashiach because we believe in Mashiach and in the word that he gave, which intrinsically we are believing in the Torah. We are believing in the commandments when we are obeying the commandments in our life and having the same testimony that Yeshua had. And to know that we were all given by the Eternal Father gifts and skills and understanding and talents that are to be used for his service and in his work through Yeshua. As Ephesians chapter 4, 4 from verse 11 to 13, Shaul expresses that Yeshua himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, or the people who take the good news, the teachers, to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Mashiach may be built up until we all reach unity in faith and in the knowledge of the eternal and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Mashiach. Yeshua's sacrifice and blood is how the covenant was fulfilled, and those who are covered and by his sacrifice and now are living in teshuvah, in obedience to the eternal, and giving the eternal a life of service because we are grateful for all what he already has given us. We don't do it because we want to get something from the eternal or we're waiting for something for the eternal, but he has given us more than enough, right? He continues to fill our life of joy, fill our life with understanding that helps us to take good decisions. And because of that, we see his mercy in our life, then that's the reason why we offer our service. And we know that Yeshua is the one who is this new covenant, because in Matthew 26 verse 28, he himself said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sin." So only when we are unified through Adonai's Ruach HaKodesh and live a life set by Yeshua, that we can be partakers of this renewed pact in the sanctuary built by Yeshua HaMashiach. And well, this is all that we have for the study for today. Thank you so much for your attention. And if the Eternal permits, then I shall see you in another video. Shalom.